The mindset that I'm in right now is basically, I'm going to build something which 1 billion people will use, multiple times a day. I'm going to bolt that as an engine of economic productivity to the long-term humanitarian research projects, and I'm just going to force this thing through capitalism. And I can't overstress the level of nihilism that it takes for Hindu clergy to wind up at war in the capitalist market for the resources to go and build housing for the poor.
This time on the Plutopia News Network, John and Scoop sit down for an extensive interview with serial entrepreneur and blockchain innovator Vinay Gupta. Mr. Gupta outlines some of his past ventures, then takes us into the present and future of blockchain and smart contracts.
Welcome to another edition of the Plutopia Podcast. The Plutopia News Network today welcomes Vinay Gupta, who is the CEO of Mattereum, an organization that seeks to use the blockchain to organize the world's property to be universally accessible and useful. Hi again, Vinay.
Good morning.
Happy to have you with us.
Good to be here.
And my friend Scoop Sweeney is here, and I'm John Lepkowski.
Morning.
So the first thing I wanted to ask about or talk about is sort of pre-Mattereum. Some years ago, when you and I first knew each other, you were focused on, I think you called it the Gupta Option, but it was, you were sort of proposing a way to make a reasonable quality of life sustainable for all the world's population. Could you say a little bit about that?
Sure. So all this stuff is unfolding in the context of, post 9/11 America, invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan, and the kind of defense community is digging in for resource conflict, right? Population is up, resources is down, we've mined out all the easy stuff, and the sort of notion is that we might wind up in a series of, nasty, complicated, long drawn out resource conflicts, which basically bleed America dry as it attempts to maintain an unrealistic standard of living, in direct conflict with rising global middle class, and the middle class are basically being chased up the ladder by the poor who are right behind them. And nobody in the defense world liked that as an option, because at the end of the day, those wars are extremely difficult to win. And so there was a lot of interest in DoD at this, in this idea of structural action to avoid long-term resource scarcity, which then avoids long-term resource conflict. So to get there, you need some alternative to the idea of a gigantic growing middle class with massive resource conflicts and massive pressure on resources. If everybody's chasing, for example, copper, there's only something like 5 kilograms of copper for every man, woman, child on Earth for their entire lifetime. We're just not in a situation where these things are kicking around in casual accessibility. So within that context, the proposal was, if you want to avoid the resource conflicts, you have to provide people with a different option to heading straight up into the 2-car garage land and then branching out from there. And the economic pressure doesn't go away, right? We all have to live with the economic pressure. So how do you decouple quality of life from direct economic competition with American citizens? This was this notion of, if you can find some way for people to have a development path which increases the quality of life but doesn't put them in direct conflict with American citizens for resources, what you have is an alternative development path, right? We took the hard development path. It's super high burn, it's massively resource consuming, but it was also designed with like 1930s technology. Right, kind of 2-car garage vision of the future. That basically is a century-old vision of what it looks like to be rich. So if you redesign the idea of what it looks like to be rich on 21st century technology, what does it look like, right? It's video projectors, it's high-quality loudspeakers, it's fat data pipes, it's access to virtual reality or 3D printers. On the production side, high-tech organic agriculture. You monitor the hell out of everything. You know exactly what you're planting in the ground. It's water filtration, using sort of novel materials and monitoring technology rather than gigantic municipal water plants and huge plumbing systems. So you could kind of go through every category of stuff. And it turns out that if you build the model on modern technology rather than century-old technology, everything looks different, right? If you had to start urbanization from scratch today, using modern technology with no cultural baggage from the past, everything changes. Houses are made of cardboard and polypropylene. Cars weigh 200 or 300 kilograms. They're largely made of bamboo. They're electric. They run on like washing machine motors, and you can just make your way down the list. And that technological jump won't make itself, right? So what I was basically proposing was, look, what you want is a concerted effort from the department to prototype and build out those technologies such that modernization in developing world countries goes directly to a sustainable 21st century model rather than grinding up the industrial path.
Did that get any traction?
Yeah. I mean, the folks that were interested in that work were extremely senior, because the case that I made at DoD was basically this. In terms of representing the interests of American citizens in the 21st century, the DoD's function as a war-fighting institution is vastly secondary to the DoD's function as being the world's best technology development house. Right? In terms of the impact on ordinary American lives, the DoD's technology output is vastly more important than its war-fighting. Right? The overall impact of Iraq and Afghanistan on ordinary Americans was massively net negative. Right? It bankrupted the country, a whole bunch of them got killed, way more of them got injured, and way more of them than that got traumatized. And was there any actual benefit to the American citizens for having fought those wars? Not that I've been able to define. Right? I mean, you might be able to make an argument that you had to spend a bunch of guys to Afghanistan to go and get bin Laden, but that part failed. They went out there to get him. They didn't get him for another 10, 15 years. So it's hard to justify those wars as being effective representation of the interests of American citizens. On the other hand, the internet, Gore-Tex, communication satellites, solar panels, and all of the other technology that came out of military spending, silicon chips themselves, all of that stuff has been enormously good for American citizens. So if you're an ordinary American citizen, DoD's primary impact on your life is nothing to do with fighting wars. It's forging the future, and then everybody follows the military technology. So if the DoD uses its R&D capacity to build a different set of technologies which are adopted by the global markets, which then shape the future of the global market and the global lifestyle, it's already done that 20 times in the last 50 years. Why not do it in an intentional way rather than just as a side effect?
Yeah, interestingly, they just started a Defense Innovation Project, which is housed here, in fact, a couple of blocks from here.
Wow.
Yeah, here in Austin. They just launched that. I went to like a ribbon cutting ceremony for that a couple of weeks ago, and it's a little bit vague about what they're going to be doing with that project, but I just wonder if part of that project aligns with what you were talking about then. Are they still on that?
So I left the States in 2007. I don't think a lot of that work survived, because although the people that I was dealing with were very much in the kind of philosopher king end of that story, that kind of radical reconceptualization doesn't really take effect at the DoD for decades. Somebody very senior says, yeah, this is really interesting. A bunch of middle tier people are like, oh yeah, right, that's important. But it's not going to get implemented, even if everybody says that's amazing, which by no means was a universal opinion.
Yeah, yeah.
Even if everybody says that's amazing, it's still an intergenerational project. Because reconceptualization of what a military is for really seems to take 20 or 30 years. And you can see that in the US. The alternate narrative of what the US could have done with itself after the fall of the Soviet Union is they could have cut the defense budget 25%. They could have used that money to buy out enormous numbers of defense contractors and troops into education and into kind of swords into plowshares retooling. Yeah. That would have put probably 2% on American GDP growth. It would have vastly increased the speed of economic growth because it would have been this massive spending on sort of improving industrial production and the rest of this kind of stuff. By the time 9/11 comes around, you have a substantially less militaristic country, and the Pentagon isn't sitting there twiddling its thumbs looking for something to fight. And in that context, you've got the political option of shrugging off 9/11 as a criminal rather than a military matter. You dispatch Interpol, the CIA, and special forces, and you leave the regular army at home. The economic growth continues on the same massive basis for another 10 years. And at that point, America's like 50% of the global economy again. And on that path, the long-term goals of American hegemony would have been reached, really without a shot fired just by economic competition, which is, after all, how the Americans beat the Soviets. Right? It was a massive departure from any kind of common sense imperial play. Like, even at the hardest realpolitik analysis level, there was no possible scenario in which Iraq and Afghanistan were going to produce benefit to the interests of the ordinary American citizen. And it's not remotely clear to me why there was any long-term strategic interest there at all.
Well, the benefits seem to have gone basically to a very small number of mega corporations that were heavily entrenched in the military, and it was more to their benefit than to the benefit of the American people.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, this is the problem with not cutting the Pentagon budget in after the Soviet Union fell. So the thing that the States didn't do in 91, 92 is they didn't declare victory. There was no Cold War winning party, right? If there'd been a national celebration of, hey, we won the Cold War, it's all over now, and you'd kind of demobbed the military, you guys have been high alert for 40 years, you won, congratulations, thank you very much, it's time to go home. There would have been the kind of wave of national relief, and then there would have been a notion of going back to a peacetime footing. And that was the thing that we never did. We never had the party at the end of the Cold War. It was never celebrated as the end of the danger. So there was no, okay, now we go back to a peacetime footing. They just stayed on the wartime footing. And if you've got all of these huge defense contractors who are churning out, tanks and guns and bombs and planes and so on, and no realistic threat, it almost to me felt like an autoimmune disorder. You'd built this enormous military machine to defend from an enormously sophisticated superpower opponent. Those guys vanish, and then it just basically sat there looking for something to bite.
They were creating solutions then in search of a problem.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's a conceptual problem. If you're in a company which has existed to produce weapons to protect America from the Soviets for 40 years, the country had an enormous kind of slab of DNA. It was think of it as being like a second liver. You got a second liver that just produces anti-Soviet antibodies in the form of tanks and guns and bombs and planes and nukes and all the rest of that. And it was looking for something to do. And I don't think the hardest part of this is that even relatively good people, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So if you've got a million people that are conditioned to think that their job is to produce weapons and fight wars, and that's how you keep America safe, unless you do something really profound in terms of the global narrative, it's very hard to get those people to stop doing that job.
Well, it's all about the money too, right? I mean, you have a defense industry that depends on wars to feed its coffers, and if those wars end, what are they going to do? Can they retool themselves? Are they going to have an inclination to do that?
And this is the Keynesian spending problem, right? Yeah. So if you were going to cut the defense budget, you had to reinvest that money and more in another round of industrial growth, right? There was no way to keep those institutions. They were so big and heavy and politically powerful. You couldn't just cut their budget without breaking the American economy in a whole bunch of crazy ways. Right? So you've got to go back to McDonnell Douglas and say, right, so we did the Cold War, we won the Cold War, that's all over now. What else could you guys do? If we keep your budget at the same level, but we want over the next 10 years 25% of that spending to be on non-military things, what have you got? And they go off and they come back and say, like, hey, how's about asteroid mining? Or they come back and they say, hey, how's about dredging the deep sea floor and pulling up all the heavy metals? Or they come back with something else that you can put that kind of sophistication to do. How would you like a version of Concorde that's fuel efficient so you could get to Tokyo in 6 hours? Oh, we'd love that, right? So you had to put them onto mega projects, and you had to keep feeding them. Partly because they were too politically powerful to just cut the budget, but also because you don't want to lose the kind of technological supremacy that those organizations have created. The end of the Soviet Union wasn't the end of superpower conflict. It's easy to forget that America is 5% of the global population, and for all its faults, America is still, one of the most politically sophisticated and potentially egalitarian societies in the world.
We're trying to undo that now.
Well, you've been trying to undo it many times.
Yeah.
I mean, the American system has gone from crisis to crisis to crisis to crisis. But compared to the British feudal aristocracy, who have had, pretty much unbridled control of that country for 1,000 straight years, it's still an amazingly open society. So, if you throw away that technological leadership and you throw away those institutions that maintain things like the weapon stockpiles, you get into a position where you're beginning to kind of break the formula of success, right? The ability to produce, the internet came from 40 years of defense spending. And there's no way at this point to separate America from the military-industrial complex. You're in, full imperial mode, and that's not really going to stop. You just have to get smarter about empire, right? Because there's no way, there's no path back down from the imperial position other than fall. So you kind of have to hang on once you're on top of that hog.
Yeah, it occurs to me this is sort of, for most people, this question of defense and defense industries and how to deploy them and that sort of thing is sort of in the shadows. They're paying no attention to it. They're not really aware of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's not surprising, but the footprint is not, it's not hard to see either, right? You just look at the defense spending and it's like there's a lot of money going into this stuff. And a lot of it's pork and it's very inefficiently spent and all that.
Yeah, expensive toilet seats and that sort of thing.
You wind up with a whole bunch of ridiculous anomalies. But the thing that I really want to kind of communicate here is that from the point where the nuclear bomb is invented, America has only really one track, which is you have to run into the future faster than anybody else to maintain technological supremacy, or you wind up being given orders by the people that played that game and won. There's a winner-takes-all quality to high-tech war that wasn't there when war was, horses and maybe cannon. Because once you're in this kind of, ultra-technology war, the ability to reach out and touch people globally comes in. So there's no sense of like, we'll be over here and you'll be over there and we're not really going to interfere with each other's business, because it's not that you have to go and take the army to go off and fight somebody, right? You can whack them with a missile, you can infiltrate their computers, you could attack their crops with bioweapons or whatever it happens to be. The global nature of war means that there's perpetual competition.
Yeah, so there's still an arms race, but it's a cyber arms race.
There's an arms race, but it's an arms race in global reach. So if everybody was at home building walls, building cannon, maintaining huge piles of horses, your militaries are never bumping up against each other. But if somebody's developing a missile that has the ability to hit the center of your country from their country, they're grinding up against each other even though they're 5,000 miles apart. There's no locality anymore. The big high-tech weapon systems all have such enormous reach that they're in constant pressure against each other. They're no longer conveniently separated by geography. So it's basically like America, Russia, China, Israel, and all the other big actors. Imagine that they all shared a border. The intervening countries, they don't matter at all from the perspective of a flying missile. So we're in a position where all of the militaries are jammed up against each other on a tiny little planet, so they're constantly preparing for war as if they shared a common border, because relative to modern weapons, they do. This is a tricky concept. The other thing is that new military technology is pouring in from the future extremely rapidly. And if you think about World War II, radar wasn't commonly understood to exist until way after World War II was won using radar. Cryptography wasn't commonly thought to exist like the Enigma machine and all the rest of that stuff, that remained classified a long time after the war. Right? So there's always a very long technological gap between what we see of the military's capabilities and the actual capabilities. And if historically you go back, and it's 10 or 20 years in most cases. So the military at the kind of cutting edge are almost certainly operating in an environment where at least some aspects of like nanotechnology are already usable. Artificial intelligence, I don't know what they've got, but they've probably got 100 times the computing power of anybody else. Do the math. Interesting. So if you imagine, what the technological frontier must look like in the black world, and then imagine that everybody's playing the same game, you can imagine that there's an enormous amount of pressure to stay ahead in that game, because if you lose, you could lose a war and not even notice. If somebody has, a military artificial intelligence and you unleash it on somebody else's stock market, and it so subtly manipulates the situation that human beings can't perceive it and then crashes their economy, that's the kind of high-tech war that we could be fighting right now, and nobody would ever know in the civilian world because it's all in, the kind of classified future. And it's kind of like a curve, right? Ultra technology, black state classified stuff might be 20 years ahead, and then you get kind of like regular military classified stuff, which might be 10 years ahead, and then you get the stuff that rich consumers have access to, which might be 5 years ahead, and then you get kind of Walmart reality, which is kind of where you are right now, and then if you're poor, you've got the stuff that washes up in thrift stores, and you're within 10, 15, 20 years behind. And so there's like a 40-year technological range between the black state and the poor. And if you take that down into, the villages, they've got a 500-year technological gap in, the rural areas of, say, Brazil, to where, we experience things. And so, we're smeared out in time, and that smearing out in time is almost more important than physical geography, because the really heavy military tech has global reach automatically. And so we're in a very different position to the one that we're commonly perceived to be in. And I think that is, that's a ratchet, just like the nuclear ratchet was. We have to maintain technological supremacy if we're not going to get screwed in ways that nobody understands. And then the downside of that is that everybody else is on the same treadmill.
And you don't necessarily know where they are on the treadmill.
Because everybody's keeping everything that matters secret, and everybody's looking for a breakout. There are large areas of computer science that I am fairly sure they just classified everything that was interesting and then it vanished. Like, remember artificial life?
Yeah.
Right? 30 years ago, all of the interesting people in computer science are obsessed by artificial life.
I
right?
remember that well.
Then sort of the fashion changes and it vanishes. Right? Just the entire field of artificial life vanishes.
Does it vanish or is it hidden?
Well, my suspicion is that, because it went from being so fascinating for so many people to just no longer being a thing. I think the academic research was defunded, and I think that it moved into the black world. Because I can't imagine that many people just lost interest in artificial life. So I have to speculate that somebody found something interesting and the entire thing wound up wrapped up and taken.
They probably built a bridge between that and AI research because there's a relationship. Yeah.
Or, and if you were thinking about, autonomous robot fleets or something along those kind of lines, you can see the artificial life research would be a sensible place to start. So, there are several things of that kind where there was a bunch of really interesting academic research and there's a ton of community interest, and then the academic research just stops. Where does it go? So, if you speculate along those lines, you could begin to see how big the gap would be between the civilian technology and the military technology. If they've had 30 years of working on evolving systems and simulators, goodness only knows what's come out of that. If you were going to do some kind of military level, cyber attack, and what you're coming out with is, artificial life viruses that have had 30 years of evolutionary pressure in military labs, you can just about see, and all of this is the sort of speculation of like, well, what if they have rockets? Well, what if their, nuclear bombs are artificially intelligent? What if they've discovered new physics? And worrying about that sort of stuff is what the sort of heavy end of the military does for a living, right? Trying to guess the other person's technological capabilities and trying to figure out how they could use them in a war that's been the real grinding surface of the military for really since the invention of the nuke. You know?
Well, just shifting gears a little bit here, that's a fascinating course we were on, but I'm interested also in how you came to the blockchain. I mean, I think when you and I first met, you had sort of developed the idea of the hexayurts, and that was a prominent subject of discussion at that time, but
Sure.
I never really saw exactly how you crossed over into the blockchain world.
So, I mean, all of this stuff comes from a kind of different perspective, right? My take on this is that I've always considered myself as basically being an individual with a foreign policy, right? You know, the nation states are really not very good at making decisions, and if we allow the nation states to plot the future course of humanity, we're going to get crappy answers. In much the same way that you got crappy answers about the future of humanity if you asked the Catholic Church what you should do in like 1750. The nation state is a massively outmoded political institution, and it's completely the wrong shape to deal with the modern world. Right? You know, global problems like global warming are going to require global solutions like global government, and there's no way around this. So, prior to 9/11, I was basically a heavyweight student of a Hindu meditation lineage called the Nath Sampradaya, and that was pretty much what I was doing. My objective was to be a householder yogi, teach meditation as I got older, and that was going to be the majority of my impact on the world was going to be teaching meditation. So that was my theory of change. I will teach meditation, that is what I'm doing with my life. After 9/11, my sort of teachers were basically like, right, no, right? Go and do something useful about the state of the world. You know, we're obviously running off a cliff here. You know, we got plenty of people in India that will teach meditation, justifying the lineage is in no danger of extinction. Go off and do something useful. And it was kind of like being demobbed, right? Like, we don't need another meditation teacher. Go and do something like that. So, right around sort of 2002, 2003, I began looking at the global problem as my problem. Okay, I've been sent on this mission to go and do something about this mess. That's what I'm doing with my life now. Okay. So the first thing that comes out of that is trying to build a model of the mess. So, okay, the obvious problem here is resource war. We're over there fighting for oil. If we don't need oil, we don't need to fight these wars. Fantastic. Takes me to Rocky Mountain Institute. I get very heavily exposed to the Buckminster Fuller work. I invent the hexayurt. But the hexayurt is invented in the context of what do we do about resource conflict? What do we do about global warming? It's a technological solution to a very broadly defined global problem. And I work from the bottom up. So, okay, we've got a hexayurt. Great, there's housing. Okay, if we put 100,000 of these in a field, what else do you need? Well, you need sanitation. You need water supply. You need to do something about food, which implies you need to do something about cooking, which means you need to do something about energy. You need to do something about lighting, otherwise people are going to fall over in the dark. And so you kind of wind up with this gradually widening spiral of concerns. And then as you get towards the top end of that, you think, well, you're going to need to know where the stuff is. You're going to need computers to organize who is where. You're going to need identity documents. 2006, I do a round of work on a genocide-resistant biometric ID card design, which basically fleshes out a space that was previously unexplored, where you've got partially transparent public records. You know, you have an ID card, you can use it for trade, you can use it for security, you can use it for travel, but it doesn't give people the ability to shoot you in the head based on your last name. And that was a kind of fusion of national security thinking with cypherpunk thinking. Because in the context of Iraq and Afghanistan, protecting people's privacy was part of winning your wars. Right? If the population had too much access to each other's data and you wound up with a sectarian conflict, the government databases were going to become things that were used to produce large-scale death in a way that would make the US look absolutely terrible. So there was all of this kind of thinking of this, gradually widening circle of concern, but there comes a point where every villager still needs the ability to prove who they are, to assert title to property, to sign contract. You need all of that capability if you're going to enable trade, which is how people pull themselves out of poverty, which is how they stop being a problem. Right? And all of this comes down to what does it look like to build a genuinely 21st century economy. Right? A genuinely 21st century economy is not 1950s in American-style industrial production, two-car garages. Right? A genuinely 21st century economy is 0.7 planets of consumption per human, living inside of a small world in which we're using the resources so efficiently that we don't wind up with resource wars. Yeah. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And you have to think of it as like the thing that I'm trying to communicate here is that the geography of conflict is no longer about geographical territory, right? And this is the core mistake that people make when we think about foreign policy. They're still thinking that the geographical two-dimensional map on the table with rings around who controls what is the actual structure of the conflict. That hasn't been true since the invention of the ICBM. Right? Once you got the intercontinental ballistic missile, you were all operating essentially in a single teacup. And then it was all technology development inside of that teacup, because there are no borders for things like nuclear missiles. There are also no borders on resource conflict, because if the folks in Brazil are using an enormous amount of copper, there's less for everybody else. Right? If the Americans are taking most of the world's oil, there's less for everybody else. If you've got countries belching out huge amounts of CO2 and methane, the atmosphere is a shared global resource. So we're in this position where the actual conflict space is defined by patterns of resource consumption and patterns of technology development. And it's all global. There is no geography anymore. Single global economy, single global battle space.
Globalism.
It's de facto where we are,
Yeah.
right? And then figuring out how you maneuver as a power block inside of globalism, what do you do to fix the world's problems so that America isn't directly exposed to the trouble?
So just as an aside, I think that we would also say that this evolution of a global perspective is triggered a resistance, which explains things like Donald Trump and the rise of white nationalism and that sort of thing. Yeah. So we have to deal with that too.
Well, so a lot of this stuff is that we totally failed any kind of intelligent, responsible globalism, right? The inability to get the agreements in place on things like global warming, the refusal to even discuss the turning of the UN into an effective institution, all of that sort of stuff. We just have an ongoing global catastrophe at a governance level. But if you want to point to, the functional end of global government, it's the International Telecommunications Union, right? And Visa and SWIFT. And those institutions are essentially all we've got in terms of functional global government. One of them runs financial payments, one of them makes sure that the satellites don't bash into each other in the sky, and that's about all we've got.
It's not just that, but it's also the fact that we have people with power and with force who completely don't understand the kinds of things that you've just said about the inherent need to take a global perspective and think globally, and are resisting it with an assumption that they can kind of roll time back to the 19th century maybe, or early 20th.
Even if those people understand, they may not want globalization because it takes away their power over certain resources that they have. So it's even having them up to speed on the whole globalization concept, it scares the crap out of some of those people.
Yeah, and I mean that's the heart of the problem. The actual situation that we're in changes so rapidly that it's very hard to keep leadership in contact with reality, right? And I mean that problem is an innate human problem. It's a really deep problem. I want to talk a little bit about time, because the core thing that I'm saying here is that time is the new geography, right? We think that conflicts are being fought over maps. They're actually being fought over timelines. Who can get up the timeline fast enough to get the technology that gives them the leverage? you hear like the Chinese government saying that, or was it the Russians, Putin, right, saying that whoever gets to AI first is going to rule the world, right? Conflict in time is very different from conflict in space. Probably the first big example of this was the moonshot, the space race. A conflict in time, not a conflict in space. Once you think about that as the superpowers are having conflicts in time rather than space, you begin to see why there's so much pressure on R&D, science, corporatization, but it's all in this conflictual space of whoever gets there first wins, right? And nobody's really counting the costs on this stuff. So the leadership problem is basically this. The guy that first figured out that washing your hands prevented people dying in childbirth because they didn't get infections was locked up in a lunatic asylum for the rest of his life, right? And it was something like 130 years before hand washing became common medical practice. Because the horror that doctors had been infecting their patients with the germs that caused sepsis, because remember all this is pre-microscope, right? They didn't really know what was happening. That horror was so enormous that the medical fraternity were like, okay, I don't care what your results are, you must be insane. So you've got this guy who's just like, no, you don't understand, we have to wash our hands. And they literally lock him up, right? That's what happens when you figure out a truth that nobody wants to deal with. And that's how you wind up with leaders that are still looking back at the 1950s as the golden age, at the same time as the people that are actually conducting the conflicts are locked inside of their labs trying to figure out how to make artificially intelligent robot killers. You know, that unwillingness to deal turns out to be a definitive human trait. Field after field after field after field after field, we've seen it. And I don't know what you do about that, because particularly inside of a democracy, people are not going to vote for people that they don't understand. So the kind of people that are smart enough to navigate that future are also fundamentally unelectable. And that's a real problem, because the Chinese don't have that problem because they're not promoting people based on electability. Something like 7 of the 9 the sort of ruling council of China are engineers. Right? In the UK government, I think we've got like 5 people with science degrees in Parliament.
And in fact, within the ruling body of the USA, we have a kind of hostility to science, really.
Yeah, absolutely. Right? And that's very problematic, right? There's no way around those cultural biases. You can't change that overnight. And so what we have is a set of problems which are basically insoluble. And this stuff is not just insoluble in a government context, right? So, the hexayurt project, 2002, right, gets scale at Burning Man in 2010. It's nearly 10 years after that. That entire time I've been telling people it's a refugee house, it's a distributed research project, try experiments, document, try different materials, try different geometries, invent things, work together. There's no public participation in that project, right? People build the same old design that we figured out in 2005, they build it over and over and over again. There's zero interest in refugee issues in that community. They're just building it for Burning Man, that's the end of their interest. And that's 6,000 hexayurts every year at Burning Man. The hexayurt mailing list is 500 or 600 people. I had somebody that was rehousing people that had been displaced by the wildfires write to me and say, hey, could we have some hexayurts? I'm like, well, you could build them if you've got the resources. She's like, we don't have the resources. Could you give us some? I'm like, well, I live in London. I don't have the ability to send you hexayurts, but we do have the mailing list. I'm sure there are some burners who've got some spare units. Send out to the mailing list, not a single reply. No offers of support, nothing, right? That's not happening because the community works, right? That's happening because people are detaching the hexayurt from its context because they don't want to think about the context. If you're somebody who's building the hexayurt for Burning Man, you're locked onto it as a way of being comfortable at Burning Man. You're not thinking in terms of like, well, this thing is a refugee's house and we're a part of a prototyping project.
Well, there was also like the disaster relief thing. I recall that after the Southeast Asian tsunami, tell me if I'm wrong, but didn't you propose using hexayurts as housing?
Oh, I chipped away at that for years.
Yeah.
I mean, I worked really closely with Netherlands Red Cross on shelter training. I trained the guys that went on to build the IKEA shelter. I spent a lot of time in the institutional R&D world around the UN and the Red Cross trying to get the hexayurt adopted. And they, right from UNHCR, UN High Commission on Refugees, they hated the hexayurt with an unholy passion. Right?
Do you know why?
Oh yeah. The fear was that it would be permanent housing, because they were cheap and they lasted a really long time and they were easy to build with local materials, and once you had the design you could do it yourself. The fear was that they were going to turn refugee camps into cities. Right? I remember very vividly a demonstration in the Netherlands where they had about 12, 8, something like that, different sort of plastic hard-sided shelter designs in a demo. So Red Cross say, right, Vinay, come to this demonstration, we want your expertise. I say, fantastic, right? And I say, how do we get hexayurt there? They're like, don't worry, we'll buy the materials, you can build it when you get here. Fantastic. Wonderful, all taken care of, all taken care of. Yep, it's all fine, don't worry, it's all done. So I arrive at the demonstration. They've got a bunch of these proprietary pod shelters and they're all crap. They've got a bunch of college students trying to put them up, and even the college students with the manufacturer's representatives there are having a hard time getting them up. There's one of them which is, it's like held together by like 700 plastic rivets. It's completely absurd, right? And they're ridiculously expensive. They're just garbage. And I'm like, great, so where are the materials for the hexayurt? Oh, we didn't get it in time, sorry. I'm like, what? And I'm just like, oh my God, I'm being screwed, because I'd seen a whole bunch of political game playing about this. So I'm like, okay then. And I have a dig around, and in a pile of construction rubble, there's a hexayurt prototype that's been sitting in, just a pile of construction waste for 2 years, exposed to the elements under a big awning. And I'm like, right, so we drag it out, and it's got some water damage, it's a little bit battered, and it's been heavily used, but, we put it up in about 10 minutes, 15 minutes with half a dozen students, and then I stick it right in line with the other shelters that are being examined and evaluated. And Red Cross are furious. They're just pink with rage. Then the high Hagian from UNHCR comes around, and I'm like, hi, how nice to meet you. This is a hexayurt. The exact phrase is, I know exactly what that is, and I'm not setting foot inside of it. They're furious. They sabotage the hexayurt testing in South America because they take it out of the shelter testing program without telling anybody. And what they say is this is because South American Red Cross has said it's too cheap and it lasts too long.
Wow.
Right? It lasts too long and it's too cheap.
So that's the not in my backyard syndrome coming into play at that level even.
Yep. And I apply a ton of pressure on this, because I'm like, okay, so what happens to these people after the tents that you put them in rot? And they're like, that's the problem of the host government. If we give them permanent housing, right, which is what these things are, if we give them permanent housing, even if it costs the same as the tents, which it does, then we're responsible for them for as long as they're in those houses. And we're not going to go around the world creating permanent cities in these bloody sheds. And they were absolutely furious. The IKEA guys put 3 million euros more by now behind the IKEA shelter. It's got something like 87 different components. It takes 5 hours to put up with a team that knows what they're doing. They catch fire, so some of the Red Crosses will no longer deploy them because they're not fire safe. And I trained the team that produced that, the Johan Carlson, who designed that shelter. I built hexayurts with Johan Carlson for years in Sweden at a series of shelter events that he was running. He had seen pictures and video of a hexayurt prototype that I'd done in the Netherlands, made on a production line that also produced IKEA countertops. Right? So we had the capability to do this thing properly, and there was just hardcore refusal by Johan to take the hexayurt and build on top of it. He wanted to start from scratch, he wanted to do it his way. And he wound up with something that was clearly a descendant of the shelter module that was designed by Tom Kersel's shelter center. Tom was the worst engineer in the world. He was crap. Right? But he was the guy that had the political skills to get Shelter Centre funded, so they wound up with a descendant of the shelter module as the IKEA shelter, and all the money is wasted. They can't give the damn things away.
Wow.
Right? few years ago, I talked to the people at IKEA Foundation that had made those decisions. I showed them the video that was made at this factory that's also producing your countertops. It is not too late to fix this. And their response was, we've already spent the money. We're not going to go back and admit error on this.
I wonder if you're going to run into these kinds of problems with Mattereum.
Mattereum is differently configured, right? Those problems existed because I was trying to work with existing power structures, and I was trying to persuade the people that had the budget that they could do a better job and they could actually solve some of these problems. Now I am just here to kill, right? I finally decided that I was at war, and the mechanism for fighting wars these days is called capitalism. So I put myself into a position where I was just going to take the fucking resources by force, by dint of having a better and more accurate world model than anybody else, and I was just going to butcher everything between me and solving the world's problems. And I don't care a shit about the consequences, I don't care about the side effects, and I don't care who gets hurt. Right? At this point, I've gone through the institutions, I've talked to everybody that could help, everybody has failed, and at that point, I'm doing this the hard way.
So in getting to Mattereum, did you sort of have this concept in your head and then discover that the blockchain would be a way to implement it, or did the blockchain sort of take you in a course where you kind of came up with this thinking?
So I'd worked on crypto and was aware of things like distributed ledgers from the 90s. I wrote something that looked very much like a permissioned blockchain in 99 and 2000. So I had a pretty good awareness of that stuff. And permissioned blockchain type technologies have been all over crypto. I mean, I know somebody who says they've found examples from as early as the 70s, right? So blockchains without mining were common in computer science. So the realization that I cannot count on the institutions for any kind of help at all, and that they're all basically just sitting on streams of resources and refusing to deploy and solving the world's problems, that realization is the total end of hope in society as it stands. Right? This is the anarchist nihilist moment of realization of like, okay, we are screwed. And at that point, the response I have is basically an armed response, right? I'm willing to destroy people and things to get these solutions implemented. And until then, I had operated inside of a very kind of Hindu pacifist perspective, right? I'm not here to hurt people, I'm here to persuade. We can all do this together. Once you decide that that's failed and you're dealing with essentially demonic consciousness, right? It's too cheap and it lasts too long, we're going to put people in tents, and when the tents rot, they're not our problem. This is demonic. This is just monstrous. There is something wrong with these people's souls if they have souls. So once you get to that realization, then it becomes a case of how do I take as much of the world's resources under my control as possible and then use those resources to solve the world's problems. And I was looking at Elon Musk and Gates, like, okay, you've just put $100 billion behind things like exterminating malaria. Right. That works, right? The charities, they're crap, cover them in napalm, light them, they're horrific. They're still having weekly campaigns, in Haiti, where they turn up and protest outside of the Red Cross offices, asking for the money that the Red Cross raised for Haiti to be divided up among the people that are still homeless in Haiti so they can go and build their own houses. Because the Red Cross just never spent the money. They embezzled something like 100 million of it to pay for the debt from their corporate headquarters that they built in Washington, D.C. Right? They literally raised $500 million and built 6 houses. There's a nasty expose about it. So that level of institutional evil, I just completely lost hope. But then there was this shining example of the Silicon Valley billionaire class that were doing incredibly effective privately funded humanitarian projects. You've got the extermination of malaria, you've got the rocket ships, and you've got everything in between. And these guys are really good at what they do. They're incredibly effective. Right? If you'd given, Elon Musk control of NASA and carte blanche, we would have been to Alpha Centauri in 15 years. Right? They would have put Project Orion back on the table and off they would have gone. So the only machinery I could see that was effective was rich dudes with a lot of money spending their recreational budget on solving the world's problems. And that's apocalyptic, right? I mean, okay, so the government doesn't work, the charities don't work, the open source movement, it turns out they can't do humanitarian innovation in hardware. We tried, it doesn't work. So I'd gone through layer by layer by layer by layer by layer, looking for a hard point on which I could then apply the lever, right? You need a fulcrum, then you can pull the lever, then you can move the world. Turns out there were no fulcrums. And at this point, I'm ready for anything. So I watched the Bitcoin thing bubbling along. It's just a currency. We've had digital currency before. It's not enough. We need something more. Then I start hearing the word smart contract. Ooh, smart contract, smart contract, smart contract. And that was the high watermark from the 90s crypto revolution. The smart contract was like, okay, that's the thing we've been waiting for. So I go and join the Ethereum team. I leave the little defense think tank that I'd been part of in London, and I get clipped on to the Ethereum community. And it's a total shit show, right? I mean, people hate each other. The technology is extremely raw. You know, massive promises have been made. There's no way they're going to be able to deliver everything they said they would deliver. You know, the community is in uproar. And I just arrive in this and like, okay, this is the best show in town. You know, it's inherently globalist. It's massively technologically sophisticated, even though the entire thing is in, you know, chunks lying around the garage floor. It doesn't really matter that the team is completely disorganized and everybody hates everybody, because once the software is written, it's written. And it's the beginning of something, right? You just light the fire and then you keep throwing on fuel. So if we get it to work at all, it is inevitable that a good version will eventually come along. And either we will turn into that good version or something will come along, fight us in our niche and replace us. So I fully engage on that with the intention of becoming extremely wealthy to go out there and fix things. And fortunately or unfortunately, early on in that process, I take a look at my legal exposure and decide that becoming very wealthy by buying a whole bunch of ether cheap and then selling it for a lot of money later on is probably not compatible with being the front man of the project talking about how great it is. Because if it turns out that the stuff is dealt with as a security, that's called securities fraud. And I figured that stuff out earlier than practically anybody else in the Ethereum world, and I divest. And people are horrified by that story. A whole bunch of my co-workers are just like, oh my God. But actually, because they weren't doing the actual talking about the project to the public, they're probably not in the same kind of position of personal liability. And, you know, we still have a bunch of US government rulings suggesting that Ethereum is no longer a security, but what was happening in that early stage is still unknown, because the SEC says, you know, it's not a security now, but it was a security at some point. So I don't know whether all of that will ever unravel or not. But 3 years ago when I had to make those decisions, you know, it was very unclear what the regulators were going to do. So I didn't go down the convenient path of becoming extremely crypto rich and then just running the show from there, which a lot of people did, like Brock Pierce, humanitarian projects, trying to do transformation, Costa Rica, all the rest of that stuff. Puerto Rico, Costa Rica, I can't remember. Puerto Rico.
Puerto Rico, I think.
So, you know, that trajectory, I just didn't like the legal risk on, because I was actually fronting a lot of the comms for the project. And you see how that would change the legal exposure. If I'd stayed on the technical side and keep my mouth shut, I could probably have kept the money, but here we are. So then I came along and I started Mattereum, and I'd been chipping away at that problem for years, right? When I was at the Ethereum Foundation, we need to go talk to the legal community, we need to figure out how to make the contract legally enforceable. At Consensus, we need to talk to the legal community, we need to figure out how to make the contracts legally enforceable. Couldn't get people to bite. Eventually I'm just like, right, we're gonna have to do this ourselves.
Because it seems like it takes a bit of effort just to get away from the focus on the token and really get to the idea of an actual contract that can be attached to a physical object.
Oh, I mean, all that token crap. I mean, you know, it just turns out that securities fraud is incredibly profitable. That's why it's illegal, right? People have a bunch of conceptual bugs, and selling them naked risk in gambling, for example, has to be heavily regulated, or your entire population will sit there strapped to slot machines all day. You know, it's like selling them heroin, right? Naked risk is just addictive to a lot of humans because they've never really been exposed to it in their biology, and it pushes some kind of stimulus reward button, and a lot of them become addicted.
Well, the biggest scam type of scam in Texas right now is cryptocurrency scams. Just people say, well, I'm going to make you rich. The Attorney General here is just spending an enormous amount of time just dealing with things that it's not really Bitcoin. It's somebody says, well, we're just like that.
Yeah.
And it's getting a bad rep to anybody dealing with crypto.
Oh yeah, I mean it's just butchery, and this is all the stuff that libertarians don't get, right? It just turns out that you do kind of have to protect people from themselves because we are unfinished, imperfect beasts. Like it just turns out that a lot of people can't tell when they're taking inappropriate risks. And that's, teenagers, jumping between buildings doing parkour, right the way up to people in their 50s and 60s spending their pension funds buying like timeshares. We're just not good at judging risk, and people are much better at exploiting our poor judgment of risk than we are at having good judgment of risk. So, the mindset that I'm in right now is basically, I'm going to build something which 1 billion people will use, multiple times a day. I'm going to bolt that as an engine of economic productivity to the long-term humanitarian research projects, and I'm just going to force this thing through capitalism. And I can't overstress the level of nihilism that it takes for Hindu clergy to wind up at war in the capitalist market for the resources to go and build housing for the poor. Right? This is apocalyptically bad. There's this phrase on the internet that people use, like, we are in the worst timeline. We are in the worst timeline. Because for some guy that should be sitting in Chicago teaching Kriya Yoga, to be, headbutting his way through the crypto swamp, trying to get to, real industrial production by integrating crypto into systems like enterprise resource planning to try and raise the funds to get to the refugees before they die in the sun. This is horrendously bad. And it's not like I didn't go knocking on every other single door first. We got to this position where I'm fully engaged in market capitalism to try and raise the resources to do the humanitarian work, because nobody is willing to fund real solutions, and none of the entities that are acting in this space have any understanding of the strategic imperatives. The climate thing is going to displace hundreds and hundreds of millions of people. The UN is completely unprepared. The nation states are completely unprepared. Nobody's figuring out where these people are going to go to.
They don't even believe it's happening.
Right?
Yeah.
And at that point, you can't mobilize the resources to solve it. But the level of kind of apocalyptic nihilism that's necessary to get things done at this level, it's just beginning to become culturally visible. There's an article by a guy called Jem Bendell called Deep Adaptation, which has had, maybe a couple of 100,000 reads, 30 pages, footnoted climate nihilism, very, very strong analysis. And the Deep Adaptation paper is really causing a lot of people to wake up and freak out. But they're still freaking out in the sort of personal fear sense, like, oh no, we're screwed. The notion that you then have to become radically committed to actually doing something about solving the problems, that is not a common awareness yet. And we've seen this ourselves, right? If you think about the shenanigans around Worldchanging back in the day, Worldchanging was, the premier global brand and community, indeed, for putting together some kind of new story about environment. It's been, 15 years, 20 years?
It's probably been 15 years since we started.
Yeah. So, we were in a position where we had the crown jewels in our hands, right? Worldchanging was the community that had the most likelihood of changing the global narrative on environment, and it failed, right? Ran out of money, wasn't appropriately commercialized, didn't make the right set of decisions, couldn't keep the community, lots of things went wrong. But if more of the people involved in that project had taken it fully seriously as the fate of the world partially depends on what we do here, it probably would have succeeded. We've been too soft for too long when we consider existential risk.
Right.
So the thing that we should have done with Worldchanging is we should have turned it into a membership organization, right? We should have had it look like a labor union.
And we did flirt with that. We talked about that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely, right? I was very strongly advocated for it at the time, and we should have damn well done it. And it's not too late to do it now. But it should have been a membership organization where everybody that was committed formally, actually, to personal change on environmental stuff, we should have unionized them. And we should have unionized them because that's how we pay for the research, right? Is it more important that I become vegan, or that I change all the light bulbs in my house, or that I bicycle to work, or that I quit my job in the oil industry? Which one of these things is actually going to help the world? People have a really hard time making that decision because the analysis requires specialized knowledge, and you either learn that knowledge or you follow what somebody else tells you. And then is that person telling it to you for your benefit or their benefit? So what we should have done is we should have collectivized the decision making on environmental action personally, and then we should have built forums for community kind of raising of aspiration, like runners do, right? Runners run in clubs because you run if you run in a club. You'll go further and faster if you're being left behind by the pack than if you're running on your own and you get bored and tired. If we'd done that for environment, we could have had a federation which sat there and did the research, like Consumer Reports does the research, or like any one of these kind of collectivized research institutions, so that people would know what to do, and you'd wear your badge, and it would be like, oh, you're also taking environment seriously. How many of the 14 transformations have you done? Oh, I'm at 11 right now. I've just moved to work, so I walk to work every day, getting rid of my car. Well, amazing, well done. Yeah, we're only on 11. We only start, we were on 6. We started 2 years ago. That sort of an approach, new social movements, Worldchanging was ideally positioned to do, and frankly, it could be started again tomorrow and it would work. The people are ready for change. They don't know what to do. It might only be 1 or 2% of them, but it might be 5 or 10% of them. Everybody that's making their own sauerkraut, these people are a community that could be converted. They just need certainty that the sacrifices they're making are the right sacrifices. And the real driver behind Mattereum, right, the reason that I'm willing to do it in this form rather than another, is that what I'm looking for is transparency about the management of the material world. Right? You were talking about things being kept in the dark.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
What's in your food? Where do your drugs come from? What is the, if you get a weird allergy, what is it you're allergic to? I had skin problems for years until somebody just whacked me in the head and said, non-biological detergent, you're allergic to the enzymes. Boom, sudden transformation.
Wow.
Right? And it was just this one piece of knowledge that I needed, which, was like small but significantly life-changing. But, why can't I tell my credit card, never let me accidentally buy biological detergent, right? If I'm at a checkout and, I swipe my card and I make the payment and it flashes red and says, hey, you bought biological detergent. I'm like, oh, wait, let me put that back, right? We've got the computer systems that could help us do these things. If you've got a peanut allergy, the software that makes your payments should be able to communicate to the store, here are the list of things that the person who owns that credit card should never buy.
Yeah, and there's also things that you don't know that you should care about unless they're exposed, unless they're in your face, sort of.
The big thing that I'm talking about these days is automated morality, right? Making the moral decision yourself every time is difficult and tiring. You ought to be able to just express what your moral preferences are and then have the software not let you spend your money in immoral ways. And, blockchain has all the necessary architectural components for doing that. Supply chain visibility, you want to know that the tuna fish that you're eating didn't come from, I don't know, whatever it is, some horrendous practice, right? You want to know that the shoes that you're wearing were not made by Chinese prison labor. You want to know that the company that you're working for isn't employing people in prisons as call center operators.
Yeah, and with your real world use case that you're working on now with the Stradivarius, it's a matter of determining how often the Stradivarius will be played and ensure that it's played and played by the right people and that sort of thing.
All this kind of stuff, right?
Yeah.
In terms of a Stradivarius, that's amazing because there's so many of them out there that will never see the light of day, will never be played. They're investments.
That's right.
Yeah, that's part of what my understanding is of what you're doing with Mattereum is that you're ensuring that they'll be played.
Yes, I mean the Strand project. So I guess I'll just talk briefly about what Mattereum does, right? So we figured out how to make smart contracts legally enforceable and economically enforceable. So if you've got a route to enforcing a contract, but it costs you $30,000 to do, in most cases you're not going to do that because it's just too expensive to do enforcement. And that's where the blockchain smart contract thing is right now. There's a well understood enforceability paradigm called the Ricardian contract. Everybody knows how it works, but it costs you 30 grand every time you have a dispute. Right? And those enforcements are legal all over the world and nobody doubts that it works. It's just really expensive. So we came along to that and we're like, okay, we're not going to get the world changed off the back of that model. You need that model, but you then need to put up a whole bunch of layers in front of that so that you don't wind up with the 30 grand ticket every time that somebody forgets to deliver something. You need other dispute resolution that will kind of divert the easy cases, so only the very hardest stuff do you have to pay up front for. And we built that. Tons of legal engineering, lots of unconventional thinking, heavyweight London barristers. The entire thing has been a nightmare of learning how the legal system operates and what lawyers really do for a living. I now know so much about the nitty-gritty of getting things done by contract creation. It's just, my goodness gracious me, the lawyers are a weird bunch. They're basically like programmers, but if programming had started 600 years ago. So they've got all of the weirdness that you get in software culture, but they do it in suits, and they drink a lot of wine, and they talk about very complicated things that
But it's
happened
based on a specific
100
language,
years ago.
like coding.
Exactly, right? They've all got their formalisms. So then you say, okay, so we've got this ability to make legally enforceable contracts, and we can move property rights around on the internet in the same way that we can move information, right? So I now have the ability to, essentially email you the right to a car. Okay, well, we couldn't do that before. Okay, we got a new thing we can move around on the internet. First it was text, then it was pictures, then it was movies, then it was music. Now we can send property. Amazing. So then the question is, well, what do you want to do with that? Well, we want it to be expensive things because we're living on the margin of the transactions, and some of those processes are still not automated, so we're going to have to do some of the contract creation by hand. The legalese will have to be custom for some things. We don't have templates until you've done it a few times. So we wanted expensive things, and we wanted things that had a set of properties where the asset didn't live with its owners. Because if you want to take something and you want to divide the ownership up between 5 people or 5,000 people, it's much easier if they're not constantly fighting to hang it on their wall like you would with a painting. It turns out that expensive violins, fine violins, are almost never in the physical presence of their owners. They either live in bank vaults or they're lent to young musicians to play. That whole field is going through transformation because the family offices that own a bunch of these things are not quite as into them as they used to be. They're not quite willing to get rid of the family strand, but they're also, that's a big chunk of their wealth, and maybe they want to liberate some of that to go do something else. So there's a bunch of transformation in the field, and they're beautifully, uniquely identifiable because you identify them by CAT scan. So you've got complete 3D model down to the fine grain of the object, and you know exactly what you're dealing with. So the objective on that project is that we want to, over the next 20 years, transfer the ownership of most of the world's strads to the classical music community, first by splitting them up among the family offices and other sort of high net worth investor types, and then secondly, by building the legal architecture, which I think will get done this year, might be early next year, probably this year, for using the crowdfunding stuff like Indiegogo to be able to sell slices of the violins to the people that buy tickets to classical music concerts. So over the course of 2 or 3 decades, every time the instrument is played, 30 or 40 people in the audience buy a little slice of the instrument, and eventually the instruments are completely owned by the community. And you need very, very strong governance that goes alongside of that, so you don't wind up with some idiot who buys 51% of a violin and then plays it in the rainforest, where the humidity destroys it and it gets woodworm. So you need strong protections that go along with democratization. You need kind of a constitutional level that protects the stuff, and then a democratic level that controls it. And that template applies to all of our cultural heritage objects. All the stuff which is in the hands of private collectors who are aging out and want to get rid of it. And at the high end, that's suits of armor from the classical period of various civilizations. It's all the stuff that was nicked by the British Raj and then stuck away in one warehouse or another and is now coming back onto the market as people decide they don't want it anymore. There's a huge sort of historical churn, and it's not clear who's going to wind up owning this stuff. So why not sell it back to the people and then let them govern it?
What I'm thinking is, you mentioned timeshares earlier. Seems like a perfect use case for this.
Yeah, absolutely, right. And all of this kind of stuff, it's just sorting out sharing. We had this kind of sharing economy bubble. We gave it a shot. It turned out that the sharing economy worked only if you had something to share, and most people who were too poor to have anything to share, like Airbnb, if you own your own house, right, then you are, making money from Airbnb. If you're renting a house and then you're re-renting a room to somebody else, all that you're really doing is making money from your landlord.
But there's more capability within the asset than is fully realized by the limited ways we have of sharing it.
And this is where the money comes from,
Yeah.
right? Because the assets have so much more utility when they're strapped to a nice digital system that enables them to be fully utilized. And all this, by the way, is drawn from a Hindu political philosophy called progressive utilization theory, which is the in-house political philosophy of a movement called Ananda Marga. And the Ananda Marga guys are kind of like neighbors of ours.
I'm familiar with them.
Two steps away from the Naths, but they're definitely fellow travelers. And progressive utilization theory basically says instead of GDP, you want to measure national waste. And the reason that all that stuff matters is, all of this Mattereum stuff comes from a clearer sighted model of how the world really operates than almost anybody has in the business world. I regularly get into meetings with a bunch of people, and the first 20 or 30 minutes of the meeting is identifying which dream world that person is stuck in and what things they are therefore unable to see. And then we have to very gently tell them all the stuff that they don't know and bring them into a condition where they're dealing with reality and you can actually make a deal. Like, oh, you're from the crypto world. You don't know what the SEC does for a living. Let me explain to you what happened in 1925. Right? If they're from the banking world, they have this weird illusion that money is in some way the same stuff that it was 200 years ago and that nothing has changed. No, in the old days it was backed by assets. Now it's just backed by fiat. Have you heard of a thing called the gold standard, young man? And you kind of have to bring them to reality. That process of making decisions based on reality, I couldn't do if I hadn't done the meditation. The hardcore confrontation with your own death is the route to getting to grips with the real world. We're all going to die. We're all going to get a certain amount of stuff done before we do. And the facing of that as a practical fact, requires basically drilling out through the bottom of the mind, and then all the garbage in the mind drains out through the hole and just vanishes into the void. Because once you understand that life is a temporary process that stops, you start asking the hard questions about what you're going to get done first. What do I want to experience? What do I want to leave behind? And everything is legacy. We're not going to be around to enjoy the fruits of our labours, except maybe a few bits and pieces here and there. The majority of our impact will be after we are gone. And we all know that, right? If you're working on world-changing stuff, if you succeed, you're probably never going to see it. Gandhi's real impact wasn't in Gandhi's lifetime, right? If you're working in the far future, the odds are you won't be there. And once you get really clear about that, there's no reward for the majority of this labor, right? You do it because it's the thing that you do because you are who you are. We stop having a whole bunch of the distorting fantasies that make people ineffective. I used to say, like, the two groups of people that you never screw with in business is anybody over the age of 50 and anybody that's got kids. Because the folks who are over 50 they've had it with your shit. They don't care. And the people that have got kids will basically kill you because it will help their child ride a pony more often. And I realized that there's a third category, which is the career meditators who can just, like Ray Dalio, the guy that runs Bridgewater, has 50 years or something of transcendental meditation practice. Maybe it's 30 years, and the legend is that he basically just bores through reality with the mind that he built from the meditation practice. Is it true? Is this real? Well, you tell me why this is real. Show me the proof. And they have this very, very weird business culture because they're constantly trying to cut through the social games and get to the facts.
Yeah, there's two weird things. It's not too weird that people who don't meditate don't understand meditation. But it is kind of weird that a lot of people who do meditate don't understand meditation.
Yeah, seriously. Productization, right? I mean, I saw a yoga studio with a bright flashing neon sign outside of it in Austin. I was just passing this bright flashing neon sign that said the word yoga. It completely blew my mind, right? It's like, oh, amazing, right?
One of the hotels has a poses and pints thing where you do some yoga and you get a beer. And it's like,
that's phenomenal. Just amazing.
Commercialization
and
steroids.
I mean, there are names in Hindu mythology for worlds that work this way. But that's where we are, right? So, there is a lot more interest in meditation, right? A lot of it is productized crap. Most of the mindfulness stuff is like, okay, well, as long as they start with that and then go do something more useful. And we need people that have done those practices, that have that shift in perspective, because they're the only ones that are willing to actually make a stand and do the work, right? I mean, you guys are obviously, well exposed to this stuff. You must have gone through the 60s pretty much head on. And
I've been meditating for a long time.
You see, right? And think of all the decisions that you've made in your life because of that meditation practice that another person wouldn't have.
Well, you talked about those fantasies that people carry with them, and that's really, that's manifestation of ego, really. People build an unreal world within their heads. And if they don't take time to just kind of let go of it and stand back from it, they're never going to know that it's unreal.
Yeah. Until they run out of resources. I think that's why bankruptcy hits a lot of people so hard.
Yeah.
Is they maintain that bubble world around them until the credit card stops working. And that's where we are as a civilization, is that the credit card is kind of not working because there's no more to draw out of the earth. There's no more equity in the global system that you can pull down. That is the big force that's breaking us out of this kind of capitalist dream world, is we can't afford it anymore. But what comes after that, I would like to think that we get the Buckminster Fuller solution, where we index all the world's resources and we index all the world's needs, and then the best people that we can find make the decisions about how to apply one to the other. And you do it in an evidence-based way. And the funny thing about that is that perfectly transparent markets would do that job, and so would perfectly transparent bureaucracies. I think the problem that we had deploying both socialism and capitalism in the 20th century was we didn't have the information architecture to keep them clean. Capitalist corruption distorted it in one form, socialist corruption distorted it in another, and I think that if those populations had had the real facts about how their economies worked, they could have applied social pressure to make them clean and to get the job done. And this is my big hope for the blockchain, is that, if we've got transparency, we can get accountability, and if we get accountability, we can get trust. And we could push that down the supply chain so we're not consuming stuff made by slave labor. We could push it down the supply chain so we're not consuming, stuff that was made by improper farming practices, whether it's stripping topsoil or torturing chickens. We could just clean it up by forcing transparency on the things that are in front of us. And in a lot of ways, that's like a meditation practice. I want to know where this came from. I'm not going to flinch from looking down the supply chain to its point of origin. I'm not going to flinch by looking down the disposal chain to its point of resolution. Where did it come from and where is it going? We ask that question of ourselves. We ask that question of our stuff. You get transparency about the beginnings and the endings of things, and it allows you to clean up what's in the middle. And if we don't do this, we're going to continue to waste things that we can never replace until there's nothing left. And we can't do it. I mean, think of what we did for information. Right? In the past 30 years, we've eliminated involuntary human ignorance for about 70% of people. Right? That's as impressive as exterminating smallpox. We eradicated involuntary ignorance. Eradicated. If you want to know, you can know. For almost everything.
Learn more about Vinay's current endeavors at Mattereum.com. With John Lubkowski, I'm Scoop Sweeney. This is the Plutopia News Network, 20 minutes into the future.